20 years. That is roughly how long it took a workforce of ordinary people, using copper chisels, wooden sledges, and their own bare hands, to raise 2.3 million blocks of stone into the last surviving wonder of the ancient world. No forklifts, no engines, no written blueprints that have ever been found. And yet the Great Pyramid of Giza still stands so precisely level, so accurately aligned to true north, that modern engineers stop and stare when they measure it. For centuries, that gap between the simplicity of the tools and the sophistication of the result has been filled with guesswork, myth, and increasingly wild theories. But over the last 2 decades, something has changed. Archaeologists found something the pyramid builders themselves left behind: their diaries, their villages, their tools, even their bread ovens. And what that evidence shows is not a mystery that needs aliens or a lost civilization to explain it. It shows something arguably more impressive: a civilization of human beings who solved an extraordinary engineering problem using extraordinary organization. This is the real story of how the pyramids were built, based on what has actually been dug out of the sand. Let's start with the single most important discovery in pyramid archaeology in the last 100 years, because almost nobody outside of Egyptology has heard of it. In 2013, at a site called Wadi al-Jarf on the Red Sea coast, a French-Egyptian team found a set of papyrus fragments buried in a cave. They turned out to be a logbook, the oldest inscribed papyrus ever discovered, kept by a middle-ranking official named Mir. Mir commanded a crew of about 40 men whose job was to ferry limestone blocks by boat from the quarries at Tura, across the Nile, to the construction site at Giza. His diary records his shifts day by day, almost like a modern timesheet. It tells us how many trips his crew made, how long each leg of the journey took, and who they answered to: a senior official named Enkhaf, who happened to be a half-brother of the pharaoh Khufu himself. This is not myth or speculation. It is a bureaucratic record written by a man who was actually there, describing a real logistics operation with names, dates, and quotas. That single find rewired a lot of what we thought we knew. It confirmed that limestone for the pyramid's outer casing was quarried at Tura, floated across the Nile on boats, and then hauled the final stretch to the plateau, and it gave archaeologists a harbor to go looking for. They found it. Excavations at Giza have uncovered basins and canal systems connected to the Nile, essentially an inland port built specifically to receive stone shipments right at the foot of the plateau. This solves one of the oldest puzzles about the pyramids. How do you move stones weighing multiple tons across a desert without the wheel being in common use yet? The answer is that for the vast majority of the distance, you don't drag them across the desert at all. You let the river do the work, and you only move the blocks by land for the final few hundred meters. For that final stretch, we have direct physical evidence of the technique, and it is wonderfully simple. In 1991, at a nearby site called Deir al-Barsha, archaeologists found sledge tracks alongside a depiction from an Egyptian tomb, painting showing workers pouring water onto the sand directly in front of a sledge carrying a massive stone statue. For decades, the scene was assumed to be ceremonial or symbolic. Then, in 2014, a team of physicists at the University of Amsterdam tested it experimentally. They found that wetting sand to the right consistency creates capillary bridges between the grains, which stiffens the surface and can cut the friction a sledge experiences by as much as half. A team of workers pulling a dry sledge through loose sand would struggle and sink. The same team pulling that same sledge across dampened sand could move it dramatically more easily. This is not folklore. It is measurable physics, and the ancient Egyptians appear to have discovered it through trial and error, then depicted it accurately enough that we could reconstruct it 4,000 years later. Now consider the workforce itself, because this is where the biggest myth about the pyramids finally gets corrected. 4 generations, popular imagination, helped along by Hollywood and by a passing line in the Greek historian Herodotus, writing 2,000 years after the fact, pictured armies of enslaved people driven by the whip. The archaeology tells a very different story. In the 1990s, archaeologist Zahi Hawass and his team uncovered a workers' settlement just south of the pyramids, now called the Lost City of the Pyramid Builders. It contained barrack-style housing, bakeries, breweries, and industrial-scale food production facilities capable of feeding thousands of people a day. Nearby, Excavators found a cemetery for the workers, separate from the elite tombs, but built with real care, modest stone tombs, not unmarked pits. Skeletal analysis of the remains shows healed fractures that were properly set, evidence of medical treatment, and skeletons of both men and women, some clearly in supervisory or specialized roles. These are not the remains of a disposable, terrorized labor force. They are the remains of a fed, housed, and medically cared-for workforce. We also know these workers were organized socially in a way that still feels startlingly modern. Deep inside pyramid relieving chambers, spaces never meant to be seen again once construction finished, teams left graffiti in red ochre paint, marking blocks with the names of their work gangs. Names like Friends of Khufu and Drunkards of Menkor have survived, essentially ancient team names, the kind of camaraderie you'd expect from a construction crew today, not from captives. Most historians now estimate the core, permanent workforce at around 20,000 people, likely supplemented seasonally by farmers during the Nile flood season when. So the labor problem is well explained. The harder question, the one that keeps this topic alive online, is precision. How did a Bronze Age society level a footprint the length of several football fields to within a couple of centimeters and align its four sides to true north with an error of only a few arc minutes? Accuracy that rivals what a modern surveyor's instrument can achieve. This is where a lot of documentaries jump straight to mystery, but the honest answer is that Egyptologists and engineers have actually tested working reconstructions of the tools available at the time, and they hold up. For leveling, the most widely supported technique involves a network of shallow trenches cut around the perimeter of the building site, filled with water. Water finds its own level automatically. It doesn't need instruments, only patience. So, by cutting the surrounding bedrock down to match the waterline in the trenches, workers could establish a flat reference plane across an enormous area without any electronic tools at all. Recent studies of the pyramid's foundation, including laser-based surveys published by researchers such as Glenn Dash, support the idea that the ancient surveyors used a method very close to this, refined by careful, repeated cross-checking rather than any single perfect measurement. For alignment to true north, the leading and best supported theory is called the simultaneous transit method. On a clear night, ancient astronomers would have tracked a single star as it rose in the east and set in the west, marking both points on the horizon from a fixed viewing spot. Because the star moves in a predictable arc, the midpoint between the rising and setting marks points almost exactly at true north. Repeat that measurement over several nights, average out the small errors, and you can reach an alignment accurate to within a fraction of a degree, using nothing but a plumb line, a marked horizon, and the sky. Ancient Egyptian texts even reference a ritual called stretching the cord, performed by the pharaoh and a priest at the founding of temples and pyramids, which appears to describe exactly this kind of astronomical alignment ceremony. None of this required knowledge that shouldn't have existed yet. It required something rarer and, frankly, more human: extreme patience, repetition, and quality control sustained over years by a society that had every incentive to get it right because the pyramid was meant to serve the pharaoh for eternity. It's worth remembering that ancient Egyptian society had already been building monumental stone architecture, developing writing, and refining mathematics for centuries before Khufu's reign. The Step Pyramid of Djoser, built roughly 80 years earlier, shows architects experimenting with scale and stone construction in real time, learning from mistakes. The Great Pyramid wasn't a first attempt out of nowhere. It was the product of generations of accumulated architectural experimentation, the same way a modern skyscraper is built on a century of prior engineering knowledge, not invented in a vacuum. It's also worth directly addressing the numerical claims you may have seen elsewhere online, that the pyramid's dimensions perfectly encode the value of pi, the golden ratio, or even the exact circumference of the Earth. These claims circulate constantly, and it's understandable why they're compelling. They make the pyramid feel like a coded message from a lost, advanced civilization. But when researchers who actually specialize in Egyptian mathematics and metrology examine these claims carefully, most of them turn out to be a mix of rounding, unit conversion coincidences, and cherry-picked measurements. The ancient Egyptians measured slope using a system called the sect, essentially a simple ratio of horizontal to vertical distance expressed in palms and fingers. When you choose a seat that a builder would find easy and pleasing to lay out with the tools available, a ratio close to pi falls out of the geometry automatically, as a side effect of practical measurement, not because anyone was deliberately encoding the circle constant. Given enough measurements taken from a large, complex structure and enough freedom to choose which measurement to compare against which real-world constant, you can find apparent matches to almost any number you're looking for. That doesn't mean ancient Egyptian mathematics was primitive. It was genuinely sophisticated for its time, and Egyptian scribes have left behind real papyri showing advanced work in geometry and fractions. It means we should be careful not to mistake impressive engineering for evidence of hidden, out-of-place knowledge, when a simpler and better documented explanation is sitting right there in the archaeological record. The same caution applies to claims about the Sphinx enclosure showing signs of ancient water erosion that would date it to a much older, wetter period of North African history. This is a real theory, first proposed by geologist Robert Schoch in the 1990s, and it deserves to be mentioned honestly rather than dismissed with a shrug. But it remains a minority position. The overwhelming majority of geologists and Egyptologists who have studied the enclosure walls attribute the weathering pattern to a combination of wind erosion, exposure of a soft, layered limestone that erodes unevenly, and periodic flash flooding and rainfall that did occur in Egypt's Old Kingdom climate, not evidence that the monument predates the pyramids by thousands of years. Extraordinary claims like this deserve real scrutiny, not automatic acceptance and not automatic dismissal, and the responsible thing to do is tell you clearly where the mainstream evidence currently stands rather than presenting a fringe hypothesis as settled fact. The same caution applies to claims about the Sphinx enclosure showing signs of ancient water erosion that would date it to a much older, wetter period of North African history. This is a real theory, first proposed by geologist Robert Schoch in the 1990s, and it deserves to be mentioned honestly rather than dismissed with a shrug. But it remains a minority position. The overwhelming majority of geologists and Egyptologists who have studied the enclosure walls attribute the weathering pattern to a combination of wind erosion, exposure of a soft, layered limestone that erodes unevenly, and periodic flash flooding and rainfall that did occur in Egypt's Old Kingdom climate, not evidence that the monument predates the pyramids by thousands of years. Extraordinary claims like this deserve real scrutiny, not automatic acceptance and not automatic dismissal, and the responsible thing to do is tell you clearly where the mainstream evidence currently stands rather than presenting a fringe hypothesis as settled fact.